This success proves we made the right choice, firing the incompetent staff," Bradley Kerr declared from the stage, his voice echoing through the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel in Seattle, Washington. The audience erupted in applause, champagne glasses clinking in celebration of our pharmaceutical company's newest breakthrough drug. I sat in the back corner, watching the man who had destroyed my career bask in glory built on lies. My name is Helena Briggs, and I am 49 years old. For 11 years, I had been the backbone of regulatory compliance at Graythorn Analytics, ensuring every clinical trial, every safety report, and every submission to the Food and Drug Administration met the strictest standards. I was the woman who caught errors before they became disasters, who questioned data that seemed too perfect, who made sure our company operated with integrity. But integrity, I learned, was not what Bradley Kerr valued when he became our new chief executive officer 8 months ago. Tonight's launch party was supposed to celebrate the approval of Novacure, a revolutionary treatment for autoimmune disorders. The ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers, and Seattle's elite mingled among displays showcasing our company's journey from startup to pharmaceutical powerhouse. Everyone was here: investors, board members, medical professionals, and journalists documenting what they believed was a triumph of modern medicine. What they didn't know was that the success they were celebrating was built on falsified trial data, hidden adverse reactions, and forged compliance documents. I knew because I had discovered it all, documented it all, and tried desperately to stop it all. My warnings had been dismissed, my concerns labeled as paranoia, and my position eliminated under the guise of corporate restructuring. Bradley's eyes found mine across the crowded room, and his smile widened with malicious satisfaction. He raised his glass higher, his voice carrying that familiar, condescending tone I had grown to despise. To those who understand that progress requires bold leadership, not the timid voices of the past who would rather see innovation stifled by excessive caution. The crowd cheered again, oblivious to the fact that their celebration was about to become a crime scene. I adjusted the silver briefcase on my lap, feeling the weight of 11 years of meticulous documentation. Every audio recording, every falsified report, every piece of evidence that would bring down Bradley's house of cards was locked safely inside. As I watched him continue his speech about vision and courage, I couldn't help but think about how different this night would have been if he had simply listened to my warnings. Instead, he had chosen to silence me, to paint me as an obstacle to progress. Tonight, he would learn that some obstacles cannot be moved. They can only reveal the truth that lies beneath the surface. The path that led me to this moment began last September, when Bradley Kerr walked into our modest offices near Pioneer Square with his expensive suits and bigger ambitions. Graythorn Analytics had always been a family-oriented company, founded by Dr. Elizabeth Graythorn 25 years ago, with a mission to develop safe, effective treatments for rare diseases. When Dr. Graythorn retired, she handpicked Bradley based on his impressive track record at larger pharmaceutical companies, believing he could take us to the next level. I remember our first staff meeting vividly. Bradley stood at the head of our small conference room, his presence commanding immediate attention. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit tailored to perfection, and his smile radiated the kind of confidence that made investors write checks. "We're going to revolutionize this industry," he announced, his eyes bright with ambition. "The old ways of doing business are too slow, too cautious. We need to move faster, think bigger, and take calculated risks." At first, his energy was infectious. The entire team seemed energized by his vision of rapid growth and market expansion. Our laboratory buzzed with new projects, and funding flowed in from investors eager to be part of what Bradley called the next pharmaceutical breakthrough. Even I found myself cautiously optimistic about the changes he was implementing. But as weeks turned into months, I began noticing troubling patterns in the data coming from our clinical trials for Novacure. Patient response rates seemed unusually high, side effects unusually low, and timelines unusually accelerated. When I raised these concerns during our monthly compliance meetings, Bradley would dismiss them with a wave of his hand and a patronizing smile. "Helena, I appreciate your attention to detail, but we can't let perfectionism become the enemy of progress," he would say, his tone implying that my concerns were both unnecessary and unwelcome. "These results aren't suspicious. They're exceptional. Sometimes breakthrough treatments produce breakthrough results." My relationship with Bradley's inner circle was equally strained. His newly hired vice president of clinical development, Marcus Webb, treated me like an antiquated relic from a bygone era of pharmaceutical development. During team meetings, he would roll his eyes whenever I spoke about protocol adherence or regulatory requirements, often interrupting me with comments about modernizing our approach and streamlining outdated processes. The breaking point came in February, when I discovered discrepancies in our safety reporting that could not be explained by normal data variation. Patients who had experienced severe adverse reactions were mysteriously absent from our official reports, while others showed improvement patterns that defied medical logic. When I presented this evidence to Bradley, requesting a full audit of our trial data, his response was swift and decisive. My position was being eliminated due to budget constraints and operational restructuring. The moment I realized the full scope of Bradley's deception came 3 weeks after my termination, when I received an unexpected phone call from Jennifer Rodriguez, a former colleague who had also been restructured out of her position. We met at a quiet coffee shop in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, far from the corporate offices where we had once worked side by side. "Helena, I couldn't stay silent anymore," Jennifer whispered, glancing around nervously before sliding a manila envelope across the small wooden table. "After they fired you, things got worse. Much worse." Inside the envelope were photocopies of internal memos that made my blood run cold. The documents revealed a systematic effort to manipulate clinical trial data, hide adverse patient reactions, and forge compliance certificates that had been submitted to federal regulators. Patient identification numbers had been altered, negative outcomes had been deleted from databases, and safety reports had been rewritten to eliminate any mention of serious side effects. The most damning evidence was a signed memo from Bradley himself, dated just 2 weeks earlier, explicitly instructing department heads to massage the data presentation for the upcoming Food and Drug Administration review. The language was carefully crafted to provide legal deniability, but the intent was unmistakable. Graythorn Analytics was knowingly submitting false information to obtain approval for a drug that had not met safety standards. "They threatened to destroy my career if I spoke out," Jennifer continued, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. "But what they're doing isn't just wrong. It's criminal. People could die from this drug, Helena. Real people with families and futures." That night, I sat in my small apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, staring at the evidence spread across my kitchen table. The Seattle skyline twinkled in the distance, but I felt nothing but darkness closing in around me. For 11 years, I had dedicated my life to ensuring pharmaceutical safety, believing that my work protected vulnerable patients from exactly this kind of corporate malfeasance. Now I faced a choice that would define not only my future, but potentially the futures of countless patients who would receive Novacure. I thought about my own father, who had died from complications related to an experimental cancer treatment that had been rushed to market without proper safety protocols. I remembered holding his hand in the hospital as he suffered through side effects that could have been prevented if anyone, had been willing to speak truth to power. I had become a compliance officer to honor his memory, to ensure that no other family would endure what we had endured. The decision became clear with painful certainty. I would not allow Bradley Kerr to turn Graythorn Analytics into the kind of company that prioritized profits over patient safety. If he wanted to silence me through termination, I would respond with something far more powerful than any corporate memo or performance review. I would compile every piece of evidence, every falsified report, every forged document into an irrefutable case that would bring federal investigators to his door. The briefcase had been my grandfather's, a silver-plated piece he had carried during his years as a government accountant. Tonight, it would carry the truth that Bradley had tried so desperately to bury. Over the next 4 months, I transformed from a displaced compliance officer into something resembling an undercover investigator. Using my 11 years of industry contacts, and my intimate knowledge of Graythorn's internal systems, I began systematically documenting every aspect of Bradley's fraudulent operation. My first breakthrough came through Patricia Chen, a laboratory technician who had been overlooked during the corporate restructuring, but remained deeply troubled by what she had witnessed. We met at Pike Place Market on a rainy Thursday morning, blending in among the tourists and fish vendors while she shared her observations. They made us rerun tests until we got the results they wanted, Patricia explained, her voice heavy with guilt as we walked past the flower stalls. When patient 247 died from liver failure during the trial, Marcus Webb told us to reclassify the death as unrelated to the medication. He said the patient had a pre-existing condition that we hadn't detected. "Did you keep any records of the original test results?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual despite the racing of my heart. Patricia nodded slowly, pulling a small flash drive from her purse. "I copied everything before they made us delete the files. I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid of losing my job. I have a daughter starting college next year." The flash drive contained a treasure trove of evidence: original laboratory reports showing severe adverse reactions, internal emails discussing data manipulation strategies, and video recordings of meetings where Bradley and Marcus explicitly discussed falsifying safety data. One particularly damning recording captured Bradley saying, "The Food and Drug Administration reviewers won't know what they're looking at if we present the data correctly. We just need to highlight the positives and bury the negatives in statistical noise." As I delved deeper into the investigation, I discovered that the fraud extended far beyond simple data manipulation. Bradley had created an entire shadow reporting system, maintaining 2 sets of books, one for internal use that showed the true trial results, and another for regulatory submission that painted Novacure as a miracle cure with minimal side effects. The scope of the deception was staggering. Of the 300 patients who had participated in the clinical trials, 47 had experienced serious adverse reactions, including 12 who had been hospitalized and 3 who had died. None of these cases appeared in the official reports submitted to federal regulators. Instead, these patients had been retroactively removed from the study through various administrative maneuvers, their suffering erased from the official record as if it had never happened. My investigation revealed another disturbing pattern. Bradley had systematically removed or silenced anyone who might pose a threat to his scheme. Besides Jennifer and myself, 5 other long-term employees had been terminated or reassigned to positions where they would have no access to clinical data. The message was clear: question the approved narrative and face professional destruction. The evidence I was gathering painted a picture of an organization that had been completely corrupted from the top down. Bradley had surrounded himself with ambitious individuals who were willing to participate in fraud in exchange for career advancement and financial rewards. Marcus Webb had received a significant salary increase and stock options for his cooperation, while other department heads had been promised promotions contingent on their silence regarding data irregularities. But I also discovered something that gave me hope. Not everyone at Graythorn was complicit in Bradley's scheme. Several employees had kept their own records of suspicious activities, creating an informal network of documentation that existed parallel to the official corporate files. They were afraid to speak out individually, but together, their evidence created an overwhelming case against Bradley's fraudulent enterprise. As the launch party approached, I realized that I had assembled enough evidence to not only expose Bradley's crimes, but to ensure that he would face serious federal charges for endangering public health and defrauding regulatory agencies. The weeks leading up to the launch party were filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. I watched from the outside as Bradley's media campaign positioned Novacure as a revolutionary breakthrough that would transform treatment for millions of autoimmune disorder patients. Medical journals published glowing articles about the drug's efficacy. Investment firms issued buy recommendations for Graythorn stock, and patient advocacy groups praised the company for developing a treatment that promised hope where none had existed before. What made the situation even more heartbreaking was that Novacure might have actually been a legitimate breakthrough if Bradley had simply allowed the clinical trials to proceed honestly. The underlying science was sound, and early indications suggested that the drug could provide significant benefits for many patients. But Bradley's impatience and greed had corrupted the development process, creating a situation where a potentially life-saving medication had become a deadly gamble for unsuspecting patients. During this time, I also learned more about Bradley's personal motivations. Through conversations with former colleagues and research into his professional background, I discovered that he was under enormous pressure from investors who had provided funding based on aggressive timelines and revenue projections. His previous pharmaceutical company had failed to bring a major drug to market, leaving him with a reputation that could only be salvaged by delivering spectacular success at Graythorn. The investigation also revealed that Bradley's fraudulent activities extended beyond Novacure. He had been inflating research and development costs to justify higher investor contributions, while simultaneously understating potential liability issues in corporate financial reports. The Securities and Exchange Commission would likely be very interested in reviewing Graythorn's books once federal investigators began examining the company's operations. 3 days before the launch party, I received an unexpected visitor at my apartment. Jennifer Rodriguez stood at my door, looking pale and frightened, carrying a small overnight bag as if she were preparing to leave town. "Helena, they know we've been gathering evidence," she said, brushing past me into the living room. "Marcus Webb cornered me yesterday and asked pointed questions about documents I couldn't possibly know about unless someone had given them to me." My heart sank as I realized that our investigation might have been discovered. "What exactly did he say?" "He mentioned specific patient numbers and test results that were only in the files Patricia gave us. He's clearly been monitoring who has access to what information. I think we're all in danger of being charged with corporate espionage or theft of trade secrets." The revelation forced me to accelerate my timeline significantly. I had originally planned to submit my evidence to federal authorities after the launch party, hoping to gather additional documentation during the event itself. But if Bradley's team was actively tracking our activities, waiting any longer might result in the evidence being suppressed or destroyed. That evening, I made contact with Agent Sarah Kellner at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Seattle field office. Through a mutual friend who worked in federal law enforcement, I arranged a secure meeting where I could present my preliminary findings and request official protection for the witnesses who had risked their careers to expose the truth. Agent Kellner was a seasoned investigator with extensive experience in pharmaceutical fraud cases. After reviewing just a portion of my evidence, she confirmed what I had suspected. Graythorn Analytics was engaged in multiple federal crimes, including fraud against regulatory agencies, endangering public health, and securities violations. Mr. Kerr and his associates are looking at serious prison time if we can prove these allegations in court, Agent Kellner explained during our meeting. But we need to be strategic about how we proceed. If they suspect they're under investigation, they might destroy evidence or flee the jurisdiction. We agreed that the launch party would provide the perfect opportunity to gather additional evidence while ensuring that key suspects remained in one location for potential arrest. The night before the launch party, I sat in my apartment assembling the final components of what I had come to think of as my insurance policy. The silver briefcase contained more than just evidence. It represented 11 years of dedication to pharmaceutical safety, the memory of my father who had died from inadequately tested treatments, and the hope that future patients would be protected from corporate greed. Inside the briefcase, I had organized the evidence into 3 distinct categories. The first section contained documented proof of falsified clinical trial data, including before and after versions of safety reports that clearly showed how adverse reactions had been systematically removed from official documentation. The second section held audio recordings of internal meetings where Bradley and Marcus explicitly discussed strategies for deceiving federal regulators, including the damning conversation where Bradley had referred to Food and Drug Administration reviewers as bureaucrats who wouldn't recognize real innovation if it slapped them in the face. The third section was perhaps the most devastating. Financial records showing how Bradley had manipulated research costs and safety expenditures to create the appearance of regulatory compliance while actually cutting corners that put patient lives at risk. These documents revealed that Graythorn had spent less than half the industry standard on safety monitoring while claiming to investors that they were exceeding regulatory requirements. I had also included a detailed timeline showing how Bradley had systematically removed or silenced employees who had raised safety concerns, creating a pattern of obstruction that would be of significant interest to federal prosecutors. The timeline included termination letters, reassignment memos, and even recorded conversations where Marcus Webb had threatened employees with career destruction if they continued to question official data. As I locked the briefcase for the final time, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since Bradley's arrival at Graythorne. 8 months ago, I had been a respected compliance officer with a secure career and a clear sense of purpose. Tonight, I was essentially a whistleblower, preparing to destroy a company that had once been my professional home, knowing that my actions would likely end any possibility of working in the pharmaceutical industry again. But I also knew that staying silent was not an option. The evidence I had gathered showed that Novacure would likely cause serious harm to patients who trusted that the medication had been properly tested and approved. Some of those patients might die from side effects that Graythorne knew about but had hidden from regulators. Others might suffer permanent damage that could have been prevented if the clinical trials had been conducted honestly. The launch party itself had become a grotesque celebration of scientific fraud, masquerading as medical breakthrough. Media outlets were already running stories about Novacure's potential to transform autoimmune treatment. Patient advocacy groups were praising Graythorne's commitment to innovation, and investors were driving up the company's stock price based on projections that assumed the drug would capture a significant portion of the autoimmune disorder market. Agent Kellner had positioned federal investigators throughout the Fairmont Hotel, disguised as catering staff, security personnel, and even journalists covering the event. The plan was simple. I would present the evidence to Bradley in full view of the assembled guests, creating a public record of the handover that would be difficult for him to deny or suppress. Once he accepted the briefcase, federal agents would move in to secure the evidence and place key suspects under arrest. As I prepared to leave for the hotel, I thought about the moment when Bradley would realize that his carefully constructed facade was about to collapse. For months, he had treated me as an obstacle to be removed, an inconvenience to be dismissed and forgotten. Tonight, he would learn that some obstacles cast very long shadows indeed. The Fairmont Hotel's ballroom was a symphony of success and self-congratulation when I arrived at exactly 8 p.m. Seattle's pharmaceutical elite mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, their conversations punctuated by the gentle clink of champagne glasses and the soft melody of a string quartet. Servers in crisp white uniforms circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres, while a photographer captured what everyone believed would be historic moments in medical innovation. Bradley stood at the center of it all, resplendent in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his smile radiant as he shook hands with investors and posed for pictures with prominent medical researchers. A large banner reading, "Novacure, the future of autoimmune treatment," hung behind the stage where he would soon deliver his victory speech. I moved through the crowd slowly, my silver briefcase drawing curious glances from guests who recognized me despite my recent termination. Several former colleagues approached with awkward small talk, clearly uncomfortable about my presence, but unsure how to address the elephant in the room. I smiled politely and made appropriate responses, all while keeping my attention focused on Bradley's position and the federal agents I knew were positioned throughout the venue. When Bradley finally took the stage at 9:15 p.m., the room fell silent with anticipation. The lighting dimmed except for a single spotlight that illuminated him like a theatrical star, preparing to deliver the performance of his lifetime. He began with gracious acknowledgments of investors and staff members, his voice carrying the confident tone of a man who believed he had successfully deceived everyone who mattered. "Tonight marks the culmination of years of dedicated research and development," he announced, his eyes sweeping across the audience with practiced authority. "Novacure represents everything we stand for at Graythorne Analytics: scientific excellence, regulatory integrity, and unwavering commitment to patient safety." The irony of his words was almost unbearable as I prepared to stand and make my final contribution to Graythorne Analytics' legacy. "This success proves we made the right choice firing the incompetent staff," Bradley continued, his voice rising with triumphant authority as the audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. His eyes found mine in the back of the room, and his smile widened with unmistakable malice. "To those who understand that progress requires bold leadership, not the timid voices of the past who would rather see innovation stifled by excessive caution. The crowd cheered again, completely unaware that they were applauding the dismissal of the very person who had tried to protect them from pharmaceutical fraud. Bradley raised his champagne glass higher, his expression radiating the satisfaction of someone who believed he had eliminated all threats to his elaborate deception. That was my moment. I stood slowly, my silver briefcase gleaming under the ballroom's elegant lighting as conversations gradually died and heads turned in my direction. The room's energy shifted palpably as guests recognized the woman who had been publicly humiliated and professionally destroyed by the man they were celebrating. Bradley's expression changed from triumph to confusion to something approaching fear as I began walking deliberately toward the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent ballroom, "I have one final contribution to make to Greythorn Analytics." The crowd parted before me like water, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and uncomfortable anticipation. Bradley remained frozen at the podium, his champagne glass suspended halfway to his lips, as I climbed the steps to the stage with measured precision. Standing directly in front of him, I held out the briefcase that contained 11 years of pharmaceutical compliance expertise and 4 months of painstaking investigation. "Here's my final contribution," I said calmly, my words echoing through the microphone system that had moments before been amplifying his fraudulent victory speech. Bradley's hand trembled slightly as he accepted the briefcase, his eyes searching mine for some indication of what was about to unfold. But I simply turned and walked away, my heels clicking against the marble floor as I headed toward the ballroom's exit, knowing that federal agents were already moving into position. Behind me, I could hear the confused murmur of voices as Bradley tried to regain control of his celebration, unaware that his world was about to collapse with devastating finality. As I stepped into the Seattle night air, I realized that revenge had never been my true motivation. It had always been about protecting the patients who trusted that someone, somewhere, was ensuring their medications were safe. In bringing down Bradley's empire of deception, I had reclaimed not just my professional integrity, but my father's memory and my own sense of purpose in a world where doing the right thing often comes at the highest personal cost.